You're listening to Apashish, a Cree learning podcast.
We have a whole generation of people in every community who are what we call kind of passive speakers of the Cree language, who understand everything, but who just won't speak. And when you ask them why, they'll say, I don't know, I just don't feel like I speak well. But they understand everything, So to those speakers out there who feel like, you understand well, the elders are speaking and you're able to understand and, you feel the urge to respond in English, you're a really, really useful and valuable part of our community, in terms of language retention and language learning. So try to speak the language. We need you. We need those of you who actually understand the language to make a little bit more of an effort to speak it, so that those of us who don't understand it all actually have more resources, can actually, have more practice.
Wajek, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Apashish, a Cree learning podcast. Oujé niska pîsîm. It's now the goose moon. So from the Mushkego education diagram, niska naspich kistina dagaso inaniwa bimat disawinik naspich beaganawan enanandotawa pîsîm nishta ispi ga dagobanet muchakeno damwak Otewak and Eniwak. So there is a translation available, but first I wanted to try to break it down using some resources that I have, mostly this online Cree dictionary. Niska refers to the goose, well, the Canada goose specifically. Naspich means very much. Gistine dagaso. I learned that it means like essential or important. And niniwa refers to people, but there's a conjugation happening at the end, because you would say eniniwak for people, or eninu for like a singular person, but it's eniniwa. And the next word is bematisoenik, so which means life, or in this context, you might say a way of life. So goose, very much essential, people, life. Like if you were to provide a simple, direct translation. But of course, like the grammar and the structure of the words are different between the two. Like we don't have words like is or ah and things like that. So according to the translation provided on this diagram, it just says the goose is an essential part of the Cree community. So, right, a Cree speaker would have to interpret the Cree into English, and they have to add the or is and part and so on, all these filler words that we have in English. So that's just my kind of interpretation of it. The next sentence goes, naspich, again going very much, be ganawan, be ganawan. I'm not too sure what that means. Inana dutta, I think refers to like the anticipation. Awa means like this. Pîsîm, moon. Nesta means and. Ispi means when. Ga, I learned using the dictionary is this indicator, anticipation, or like the something, a future tense. Dagobanet means like arrive. Muchakeno damwak refers to joy or being happy. Otewak, so otehe means a heart, but because there's this is being pluralized, so otewak, so hearts, and niniwak, so people. So very much their anticipation this moon and when will arrive, joyful hearts, people. But again, so you have to interpret that to Cree, and according to the one provided, the call of the goose is greatly anticipated, and its return is a joy to the heart of the people. Yeah, that's just my attempt to dissect and then interpret what that means. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. But yeah, so it's now April, niska pîsîm. Everyone's getting excited up here for the upcoming goose hunt. I took another trip near the end of last month. Went up the Winter Road again, hauled things to the camp, trying to get it ready. And then that same day, after I got back from the camp, I hit the Winter Road right away because it was closing at midnight that same day. So at 9 p.m., I was back on the Wheaton Winter Road to come back to Timmins before it closed, because otherwise I would get stuck there and I would have to take the train. Getting very excited. This weekend, I was seeing posts about goose sightings. Somebody here in Timmins saw a flock, and somebody up the coast was posting a video of people, seeing a goose and trying to call them. So a lot of excitement this time of year up here, and I'm very excited. These sightings that we're seeing are the early geese, and my dad would always describe the goose season as having three stages. So he described the first stage as the surveyors. These are the early ones that come in. So if you go out to your camp early on, you don't see the geese a whole lot. Sometimes you might go a whole day without spotting any. Sometimes you might see them a couple of times, but they're in the distance. But yeah, they're not flying a whole lot. But then we have what's called, what my dad calls like the main flight. It's a time when they're flying pretty often, and there's usually a couple mornings that are really fun and exciting. It's they're just flying so often. Oh, there's another flock over here. Oh, there's some over there. Like you're just seeing them, all the time. And sometimes you don't even have time to go pick up your geese that you shot because there's more coming. So you got to load up and get ready for those. So those are very exciting times. And then the next stage is the what my dad calls the stragglers. So the majority of the geese are gone past, and here are the leftover geese coming that have fallen behind, or they're just late and coming up. And again, you're not seeing them as often as before, maybe a few times a day, get a few here and there. But yeah, it's that's how my dad described it, the surveyors. And that's where we're at right now. We're seeing the early ones. I was talking to my uncle the other day. Yeah, and he was like talking about these sightings. He's like, yeah, the scouts. And then I reminded him of what my dad said, and we had a laugh at that, the surveyors and the flight and the stragglers, as my dad would say, and kind of have a laugh at that. But anyway, yeah, so by the time this episode comes out, I'll be, getting ready to head up to Moosonee, take the train, and from there go out to camp, looking to take the skidoo because there's still a lot of snow out there. And if it's too difficult, or might have to take a helicopter, but I don't think so. I think there's a lot of snow, and it might be a little difficult. So, just going back to what my uncle said, he was suggesting that we go early in the morning because otherwise, what's going to happen is we're going to have to deal with Saskatchewan. And I remember learning this word some time ago when I was at my blind with my dad, and my other uncle Johnny. He was at a different blind, and he had to walk by our blind so he can go back to his camp. So he stopped to chat, and then when he continued his way toward his camp, uh, you know, um, starting to struggle a bit walking in that snow because now it was the late morning, the sun was out, so the snow, which had hardened overnight, was now getting soft. And anyway, so he stopped and looked back, and he said to my dad, "Saskatchewan." So that refers to when the snow gets soft. So I remember asking my dad, like, "Hey, what's that mean?" Saskatchewan. And he gave that definition, and remembered it ever since. And so when my uncle mentioned it, it's like, "There's this word we have, Saskatchewan," and I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's when the snow is soft." So Yeah, so that happens, in the springtime, the snow gets soft. It becomes challenging to walk through it, or if you're trying to take a skidoo to go to camp, it can get pretty difficult. And the trail to our camp is pretty fairly long, and there's been years where people can't make it all the way to camp because the trail is just so bad. It's thawing out, and it's difficult for the skidoo with all the bumps and all the water to get through. But I don't anticipate having that much of a challenge with all the snow. We just have to make sure, like my uncle suggested, that we go early in the morning when the snow is still hard. So I mentioned in the last episode that I was going through the modules on the online learning platform by Language Foundry to learn Moose Cree. So in the last episode, I mentioned I was on module 9, but now I'm only on module 11. It's been busy in the past few weeks, so haven't had a whole lot of time to get through them, but it's still been learning quite a bit. So the modules that I've been going through lately have dealt with like conjunct, like how to join different words together, and we're still dealing with what's called VII, so verbs, intransitive, inanimate. So like it is type of words, statements. So just to explain again, because I think I explained this in the previous episode. So there are two main types of verbs. There's intransitive, where the verb needs the noun or the subject. It can't sit on its own, so it needs the other word. So she bought a book, for example. So bought. You can't just say she bought. You need the other words to go along with it. And transitive is the verb that can sit on its own. So she slept. And then for animate nouns, usually it refers to things that are alive or that move in general, whereas inanimate refers to things that, aren't alive, or like a rock or something. So right now we're dealing with verbs that are intransitive. We deal with inanimate. Still have to go through the transitive at some point and the animate and the different variations. So VII, VIA, VTI, and so on. The different the different variations of the verbs, combining the inanimate and animate and transitive or intransitive. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm probably going through too fast, but this will come up later in the interview that we have. So, just an example of some of the modules and how we can combine words together. This is just an example from one of the modules. So, two words that we might have is takayao, which means it is cold. And then you would say pipon, means it is winter. And if you're trying to say it's cold in the winter, you wouldn't just say takayao pipon. To combine them, there's some changes that need to happen. We need to have one sound in the middle between them, and then the ending of the word for pipon has to change. So because it has a N sound at the end, pipon, that needs to change to an ich sound, piponich. So piponich means when it is winter. So if we combine them, it's tachayo piponich. It is cold when it is winter. So that's just one of the examples they have in the modules there. So it's pretty interesting, and I'll continue to go along with that when I can, especially when I come back from hunting. I mentioned in past episodes that I was doing this whole flashcard system and trying to do like 15 words a day and get up to 625 words and whatnot. I haven't done much on that front, to be honest. I've been trying to focus mostly on these modules. I found like trying to do 15 new words a day and then reviewing all the past levels. If you remember, there is like a 7-level system, and I had to review like level 2 for the day, and it can be like quite a lot of flashcards for that day. Anyway, it was definitely more than I thought it was going to be in terms of the number of words and the amount of time it would take in the day, and I just honestly haven't kept up with that. But I've started to create these new ones using syllabics and using the words that are provided in the in these modules. And like I said before, that this learning platform, to Learn Moose Cree, emphasizes the use of syllabics, and I find that my syllabic reading has improved quite a bit. Last weekend, I was at the Northern College campus over here, just in South Porcupine, and in the building they have these in the signage that they have. They have it in English, French, and then syllabics for Cree. I was going by one, and it said "Mitawagamic," and I was able to read the syllabics, because it's not written in any English form. Mitawagamic, and I was able to translate that. It means basically play room. So that's the Cree word for a gym. It's a room where you play. And I knew that because actually from my old flashcard system, I learned a few words with that word gamic, where nabawe gamic. So room where you sleep. So a bedroom. Or akasoe gamic, which akaso means like sick. So akasoe gamic, like, so a sick building would be a literal translation of for the hospital. But yeah, so gamic is an example of a morpheme in linguistics, where it doesn't have meaning on its own, but if you apply it to these other morphemes and units of words, you create an actual word or even a sentence. So akasoe gamic, napawe gamic, mitawe gamic. And this comes up in my interview as well. So this is a good segue to introduce my guest for this episode. This month, my guest is Kevin Brousseau. Kevin is a lexicographer of Cree, known for his dictionaries of Moose Cree and East Cree. He also maintains a lexical database on the Abitibi dialect of Anishinaabe, with plans to publish a dictionary. In the past, he has undertaken linguistic fieldwork in other Cree dialects, such as Eastern Swampy Cree, Atakamek, and Western Innu. Aside from lexicography, his interests include dialectology and historical linguistics. He is a Waswanipi, which is the word for Waswanipi Cree, and lives in Oujé-Bougoumou, a small Cree community where he practices full-time as a family doctor. So I first heard about Kevin when I was Googling Cree dictionaries, and I came across one that was just coming out in December, Lexical Roots of Old Cree, an etymological dictionary. So Old Cree is just theorized ancestor to the modern dialects of the Cree language in the modern day. So that came out in December. It's essentially a book of morphemes that I describe, not like a dictionary with full-on words per se, as he would describe. He describes it better when he talks about it. So I found out about that dictionary that was coming out, and I ordered it, and I have it. You can also find most of that on oldcree.com. I think most of the entries that are in this dictionary are available on this website. If you click on like the different terms, you can find it gives like the variations in the different dialects and what the base meaning is. It's pretty interesting. And I also saw that he worked on the Moose Cree Dictionary, where the fourth edition just came out last fall. And I talked about that with Geraldine Governor, and she did mention working with Kevin on the project during our conversation. He also has a blog, creelanguage.wordpress.com. And yeah, he has some entries about some grammar lessons, some stories, and like legends and things like that, and other interesting tidbits. But during our conversation, he talks about his journey growing up, not speaking Cree, and how he eventually went on his learning journey. Talks about studying linguistics and getting a master's degree, and then eventually going to medical school and becoming a doctor. And then he talks in length about how dialects evolved, how Cree is different from English, and some suggestions on what communities can do to preserve the language. If you have any interest in how languages work, especially Cree, you're going to enjoy this. So here's my conversation with Kevin Brousseau.
My name is Kevin Brousseau. I'm a medical doctor working out of Oujé-Bougoumou in Quebec, a small Cree community west of Mistisney. I'm also a lexicographer. I've been responsible since 2012 for the compilation and editing of the Moose Cree Dictionary.
And you're originally from Waswanipi?
That's right. My mother's family is from Waswanipi. Yeah, and I grew up in a small town a few hours from there called, actually has a French name called Valsenville, which is a little countryside village next to the town of Val d'Or, which many of you viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with.
Oh, was there like a sizable native population there where you grew up?
No, actually, this is kind of like these traditional kind of farming villages in Quebec where there's one road basically, and we lived near the end of the road. That was it. The population was really small. No real downtown area, but we were probably around 30 minutes away from a slightly larger town called Senneterre, which actually did have a sizable Native community, and in fact, that's where we used to drive to every Sunday for church. There used to be a traditional a Cree church, I mean, in that area back in the days, where people from Waswanipi who had settled in the area would actually gather for services.
Oh, okay. And who were your parents and what did they do?
So my mother is a lady from Waswanipi named Jane Saganash. She actually worked for over 2 decades for the Cree Health Board, actually in the town of Val d'Or. That was her career. She's retired now. My mother has quite an interesting history, at least from my perspective. She's a lady who, although was sent to residential school, like most people of her generation, managed to only be sent at 9 years old. So that made quite a different perspective compared to a lot of our elders in our families who had been sent out at 4 or 5 years old. So I always felt very blessed to have a mother who had a lot of recollections about the life out in the land, about the traditional lifestyle. So it gave me a lot of insight growing up, about what was happening and how things were changing for our people. I always thought that was a very interesting kind of upbringing she had. My father was a French Canadian man from Senneterre, actually, that small town that I just mentioned.
Hmm.
He's now passed away, God bless his soul, but he worked most of his life as a heavy machinery salesperson, also a car salesperson, and eventually campers and Winnebagos.
Oh, okay. And did you have any siblings growing up?
Yeah, I grew up with an elder sister. Her name is Melissa Saganash. She's been working for decades, well, a couple decades now for the Cree Nation government. She's actually the assistant director general of the Cree Nation government.
Wow.
I grew up with a younger brother named Brian Brousseau. He also works for the Cree Nation government, but has switched positions recently. I'm not sure exactly what the position is. This last position is, but he's been working for the Cree Nation government as well.
How many years did you live in that small town?
I think we must have moved there around when I was about 4 years old, I believe. My mother eventually moved us. So our family situation was like a lot of families. I think in our generation, eventually ended up in a divorce. Sad to say.
Hmm.
So I grew up with my mother was basically single most of my life, and we moved to Val d'Or actually, which is that other town I mentioned where she actually worked when I was about 15 years old, I believe. So I lived there about 11 years, which this place that I called home is really the only place I really considered home. I lived there about 11 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was it like growing up there for you?
I mean, when you live in a little trailer home at the end of a dirt road, it's kind of isolating.
Hmm.
I mean, there isn't much to do. I mean, you can get on your bike and ride up and down the street, or head into the woods and find some adventures as a little boy. Of course, there was an abandoned farmer's field not just across the street, actually. So we would often just go sit in the grass, look at the clouds. It was probably a good thing in the sense that there wasn't many things to get in trouble with back in that little town. So that was probably a good thing. You got to be bored a lot and got to use your creativity a lot. So I spent a lot of my time drawing, a lot of my time reading, a lot of my time just walking around in the woods.
And growing up away from your community, did you still get a sense of your sense of Cree identity and culture?
Yeah, so actually, the interesting thing about Waswanipi is that the village is not actually that old. So it was it was quite common, in fact, when in my youth, actually, to encounter people from Waswanipi who did not live on, quote unquote, the reserve. The community had only been built a few years before I was born, and in fact was only built where it was built because of, during the proceedings against Hydro-Quebec at the time in the 1970s. The community had been warned to evacuate their traditional community, being told that it would be flooded. So that traditionally Waswanipi is a small island on the lake Waswanipi, which is perhaps an hour west of the community nowadays by road. So the community was eventually built where it is today. I forget the exact date, but this was in the late 1970s. And as a result, the in the interim, most of the community had been dispersed. So for quite a few years, people were either living in a small village of Miquelon, the town of Senneterre, which I mentioned, also in the town of Chapet. So when the village was eventually built, the housing list was quite long. And for most of my life, and in fact, I think this goes on to this day, there are people on the list waiting to get housing. So Waswanipi is kind of a strange community in that sense that it didn't really take root like some other communities, 100 years or 200 years ago, in a sense that people were living there and it just got overcrowded over time. It kind of never had enough homes for the community of Waswanipi. And my family, along with some of my cousins, were some of the families that actually grew up outside of this new community. Now, in terms of connection, I would say, like I said, Senneterre had a sizable Cree community. Val d'Or as well. When I was growing up, I was actually bused to school. There were quite a few families there as well. So we always had connection with other Cree families. I grew up around a lot of Algonquin people as well, which of course are Anishinaabe people. But we were lucky enough that we were very close to my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandfather had passed away before I was born. And my maternal grandmother spent a lot of time at our house, would often be visiting, would be taking us into the woods to set snares. My grandmother was a monolingual Cree speaker, didn't speak English or French, so it was quite an immersion whenever, a linguistic immersion whenever she was visiting. And of course, on my father's side, we actually, my grandparents actually lived in the town of Val d'Or, so we got to see them as well on a weekly basis.
Well, and did you speak Cree when you were growing up?
My mother had, this is an interesting thing about residential school survivors, right? A lot of them
Mm-hmm.
had made active decisions not to speak Cree to their children for various reasons, and I think we could spend a long time talking about those various reasons and the stories we've heard growing up about this. My mother is one of them who admitted when I was younger to have made an effort not to speak Cree to us. In her mind, the idea was if we spoke English and French only, we'd have a better chance at getting work. Where this idea crept into the minds of our people that speaking in our language could make it difficult for us, to get job opportunities or whatnot. There's all kinds of reasons, but we were not spoken to in Cree in our household. Now that kind of made it difficult when my grandmother would visit, and all we heard was Cree for the next week. But what it did do, though, is that it created a kind of immersive environment where when we do decide to learn the language, it's a lot easier to pick up. The accent is there. We have familiar vocabulary. So I grew up hearing the language quite regularly, and in fact, my mother would spend hours on the phone with with my aunt, for example, who lived 15 minutes away, but they'd be on the phone for hours in the evenings, and all we'd hear was Cree. So there was a lot of Cree in the home. There was French in the home when my father was around. There was English in the home, of course. So I've always felt like we've had a trilingual home, even though we were not actively being addressed in the Cree language. We were exposed to it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very similar to my upbringing, where we weren't taught Korean, but I was still around it a lot, hearing my parents speaking to their family and whatnot. Where did you go to high school? Val d'Or? I guess you would have went.
Yeah, so I was bused to Val-d'Or for my elementary school and my high school. The high school used to be called St. Joe's or St. Joseph's High School, but eventually, when the Quebec government reorganized the educational system, eventually put the various English schools together in the different towns, and so there was a high school called Percival High School with which we kind of joined. And that was eventually changed to a school called the name was eventually changed to Golden Valley High School, which is kind of a funny story since when we were, I believe, in secondary five, which I believe for you guys would be like grade 11, we don't have a grade 12. When we were in secondary five, we were told that they were thinking of rechanging the school name. Well, changing the school name, sorry, because the schools had actually come together a couple of years before, but they were kind of going with a double name, St. Joseph's and Percival High School. And there was this running kind of not a joke per se, but kind of a funny comment that we would make in Val d'Or, because the word Val d'Or literally means Valley of Gold in French. So this kind of had this comment that would comically be made by Anglophone speakers when we were young about, oh, we live in the Golden Valley. And so somebody in my class said, let's call it Golden Valley High School. And actually, the name was chosen. So that's how the school got its name,
Oh, wow.
Golden Valley High School.
And were you, I would imagine you were like a strong academic student?
Um, uh, yeah, that could be, looks can be deceiving, right? So I did well in my elementary school. I remember that, and I remember being told by my parents that the school was asking my parents if they would allow me to skip a grade, for example. My parents said no, and they kept me in the same grade. So I know I did well in my elementary school, but I didn't do so well in my high school years. So I did okay, but what I would say is, as the years went on, my grades kind of slowly, decreased. So I was not a strong academic student in the sense that I hadn't really developed the good study skills that you need, to do well.
Right.
But this is when you grow up in a family that's divorced, and Val d'Or had its own kind of problems as well. There was, in the 1990s, especially in Quebec after the Oka crisis, a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination. You'd be a witness to violence on a regular basis. You kind of become maybe apathetic to certain things, and I would certainly count myself in as one of those who kind of became apathetic towards school in the later years in high school. So that would explain partially that. But I picked myself up late in my adult years, and got back into school, and eventually did very well. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, and you eventually earned a master's degree in linguistics. So, what sparked that interest to get into that field?
So it's one word, dictionaries. So it seems kind of odd, but as a little child growing up at the end of a road, at the end of a dirt road in a little village called Valsenville, I didn't have much to do, and what I noticed from a young age, and my mother can attest to this, my family members can attest to this. I've always been kind of amazed at dictionaries. I would sit down and read, the English dictionary. I remember reading the index at the back of, I don't know if it was the Webster's or whatnot, but the Proto-Indo-European root section at the end of the dictionary. I just thought dictionaries were awesome, and I must have been pretty young, 6, 7 years old, when I was going through these. When I go to the bathroom, some kids might bring their video games or whatnot. I would bring the dictionary, and I would read through the dictionary. So my mother had made an effort to kind of purchase some books for us, to try to encourage us to read. My mother was always a big reader. And so I remember her purchasing at one point, a very cheap encyclopedia that some traveling salesperson was selling. So we had an encyclopedia and we had a dictionary, and I would spend time reading these things. And so in my teenage years, I kept asking, like, where can we get a Cree dictionary? How come we don't have a Cree dictionary? I love dictionaries, and we couldn't find anything, comparable in the Cree language. And so my aunt Louisa, thank you, Louisa, bought me my first Cree dictionary, which was actually a French Cree dictionary from a man called Louis-Philippe Vaillancourt, who had produced a Cree dictionary based on the dialect spoken in East Maine on the East Coast. And so, of course, I spent hours poring over this dictionary and just obsessing over it. And so, as the years kind of progressed, I started thinking about, like, well, why don't I'm speaking about this French Cree dictionary. It wasn't a very large dictionary. It wasn't a remarkably high quality dictionary. It kind of filled a need, and that was about it. And so I started asking myself, like, why don't we just actually produce a dictionary? So this kind of became an obsession early on. And so as a young adult, I wondered to myself, like, if I were to go get an education, what would make the most sense? Being my first choice would be something that I love, which, I encourage my kids, try to get an education in something you love. And, if that doesn't work out, then we start thinking about actual jobs. So in my mind, I had really been thinking, like, okay, what can help me actually understand how to build dictionaries properly? So this is why I eventually settled on linguistics. I figured to myself, well, actually, it'll help me understand what grammar is, what language is, how to think about it systematically. So I did a bachelor's in linguistics. and eventually went to a master's in linguistics. And that's kind of like what I use to kind of educate myself in doing the work properly.
And I would imagine, like, as part of your thesis, you used like Cree, like to study.
For my master's thesis, I actually wrote a thesis on actually an older dialect of how can I say, the subject matter was an older dialect of Cree that was spoken in the Saguenay region that had been preserved in manuscript dictionaries collected by Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s and the early 1700s. So that was kind of like the data for this work that I did. But it was a study on morphology, so basically the internal structure of words.
So, what did you do after you graduated? I understand at some point you were the Cree language coordinator for the Cree Nation over there in northern Quebec.
Yeah, so when I graduated from my master's degree, I wish I had the exact date. I don't remember if it was 2011 or I don't quote me on the date, but I think it was around 2011 when I graduated. And what I did is my first thought was like, okay, now that I got my master's, let me actually try to apply this and get some work. So of course, it's not like band councils or regional organizations really think about dictionaries other than perhaps in their pedagogy kind of their thought about creating pedagogical materials for their schools. So what I did is I wrote letters to all the Cree entities. I wrote a letter, to the Cree school board. I wrote a letter to Moose Cree First Nation. I wrote a letter to the Cree Nation government, and just trying to find out like if there was interest in hiring somebody who had some training in linguistics to start thinking about language work. And so eventually I was able to reach somebody at the Cree Nation government who started talking about the needs basically that they had been talking about creating some kind of organization around the Cree language for a long time inside the government. And that's how I got that job. So that job was basically created to allow me to start opening that, looking into that file. That's why I was hired there. And basically, back in the 1980s, some people had spoken about developing what they called at the time a Cree language commission. And so basically, I opened the file. I started, doing the research. Hired a few people to build a team, and managed to unlock some funding. And today we have a Cree Language Commission. So during my 4 years there, we wrote some documents, basically guiding the development of a Cree Language Commission, and to develop what became the Cree Nation government's first law, basically Bill 1, which is a bill on the Cree language. So we wrote the draft for that language law, basically trying to create some legal tools to help promote the language, basically. And the law basically came into effect a year after I left. I had left the Cree Nation government to go to medical school, basically, and in that intervening time, the law actually was approved, well, modified and approved, and became the Cree Nation government's first law. And during that same year, the Cree Language Commission became an official thing. The first language commissioner was hired, which was Jamie Moses from East Maine. So that all kind of came to fruition as a process of as a result of the work that I did for the Cree Nation government during those 4 years.
Oh, amazing! So, what kind of things does that do for the community in terms of the Cree? Like, did that create some language learning programs or some new curriculum?
Well, the Cree Language Commission is still, I don't follow it closely, but it's still something that's in development right now.
Oh, okay.
The notion of a Cree language of a commission, I should say, of a language commission, is really to study the issue, find out where the problems are. Why are children not learning the language, for example? What are the fluency rates? What are the needs for people who are monolingual speakers, for example, or even bilingual speakers? What are the needs? And to help guide basically the development of those, how can we can address those needs, guide the development of the tools that we need to address those needs. Some of the things that the commission was supposed to address, for example, is the provision of services by various organizations and businesses in the region. So, for example, if you have a business with a certain number of employees, that services in the Cree language should be available. We understand if you're just a coffee shop owner and you're just two employees and none of you speak Cree, we can't really, you don't have the resources necessarily to ensure that the language is used in such a small institution. But if you're in an organization that has 30 employees, you serve a large portion of the community, then the Cree language should be offered to clients or patrons who need your services or make use of your services, for example. So those are the kinds of things that a commission is supposed to kind of actually was supposed to kind of look into. I'm not sure where they're at in that process. And also, working at the creation of resource materials, reference materials, things that can be used to actually encourage the promotion of the language as well. So That was kind of like the point of a language commission, and is the point of a language commission, I should say, in other places in the world. For example, in Ireland or in Maori country in New Zealand, for example.
And you had left a position to, as you said, to go to medical school. So you went to Northern School of Medicine. So this was around 2015. You were in your mid 30s by then, and you had a wife and three children. So why the sudden change and
Yeah,
why the sudden shift?
so yeah, it does seem kind of odd from the outside for sure. I've always been a person who's been curious, about a lot of things. I loved science, and to be honest, around 15, 16 years old, my thought, in terms of a career, but nobody sits there thinking you're going to make a career making dictionaries. So this kind of came out like I was kind of like, well, let me try, but it wasn't really the original plan. So in high school, my original plan was, okay, I'm going to go study sciences, and what can I do with sciences? Maybe become a doctor. It was kind of like a thought I had in my mind. And a couple years into it, as my grades were not, dwindling, I kind of put that out of my mind. And so this kind of idea kind of took root again when I was working for the Korean government. I was living actually in in the community of Oujé-Bougoumou, where I actually reside presently as well. And I was just having a conversation with my wife and just talking about, the plans and dreams as a teenager. And I said, you know what? I wonder what it would look like to actually think about, accomplishing that once and for all. And I went back and looked at the requirements, and this was maybe a year before I had applied. And I told my wife, you know what? I feel like trying. This is something that I kind of wanted to do. I like sciences, and I'm not sure I see myself working on language policy my whole life. Dictionaries would have been a different thing, but it's sad to say, but there's no money in dictionaries. And unfortunately, even though there's a great need for high quality Cree dictionaries. So when you have three kids to feed, and finances are obviously part of the question. I decided to kind of give it another shot, and I applied, and by a stroke of luck or God's will, however you want to see it, I managed to get in. To the Northern Ontario School of Medicine in Sudbury for a medical school. I think I was 35 years old when I got accepted.
And I understand during your studies, you had a serious health issue. I think it was during your second year. So you developed a brain tumor. So when did you realize something was wrong?
Wow, you really do your research there, Lenny. Yeah, actually, well, it's not an easy thing to go through, and I know a few people who have been through similar, health scares in their 30s, and when you have three children that you're providing for, and everybody's kind of dependent on you, it's definitely a scary thing to go through. But in my case, it was 2017. I believe it was January 2nd. Literally, I woke up. We had an exam in a few days. I woke up to study and realized that basically half my vision had disappeared. I couldn't see properly. I would be looking at the book, and half the page was, not visible. So thinking it was maybe just a migraine, it would be an odd thing to kind of start having migraines in your late 30s. But I was thought to myself, maybe it's a migraine. I heard some people sometimes get some visual kind of effects with migraines. I didn't have much experience. It's not like anybody in my family really had migraines except for a cousin of mine that I had heard of. So I was about to go just take a nap. Said, let me see if I could, sleep it off. And my wife, thank goodness, was more nervous than I was and said, no, 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 we're going to the hospital. So that's basically what happened. We went to the hospital, and a few tests later, I was announced that I had a brain tumor. That's basically how it happened.
Wow. And and then you got it treated. You had surgery, right, to have it removed, and understand it was benign.
Yeah. Yeah, it took about 2 weeks to get the results, but those 2 weeks, they planned the surgery pretty quick. The tumor was quite large. It was, I believe, 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters. This is the size of like I think a tennis ball or something. I'm not sure exactly what ball, but it's a pretty large ball. And they operated within a week and a half, and a few days later, they came back with the preliminary results, and then eventually the final results. So, I mean, just by imaging, looking at the MRI results and the CT scan, the original thought was that it was a malignant tumor and that I probably only had, a few months to live, if maybe a year, So in my mind, medical school was out of the question. It was time to just kind of like wrap things up. But, thank God I was given a positive result, within 2 weeks, which, which was really, really encouraging.
Right. And so, how did this affect your studies?
Of course, I had to step out from my studies for a couple months, but the the main difficulty when I stepped back in was that because of the location of the tumor, my vision had actually been affected. As you recall, my first symptom was actually a visual symptom. I had actually difficulty. Basically, I would get these headaches, basically where half my vision would disappear. You know, the same way that my first presenting symptoms resembled my presenting symptoms a few weeks before. And I had this problem, you know, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. Eventually it came to once a month. Like slowly, the headaches would start going away, but I would get them still regularly for a few years. Where when they would happen, I wouldn't be able to basically read for a few hours. But beyond that, it took maybe 2 3 months for my regular vision to actually stabilize. So I was not able to focus with both eyes open. I would have to close one eye to be able to read or do whatever. Of course, there was no driving during that period as well. So that was quite difficult. Basically, I was walking around, reading, going to classes with my hand over one eye, basically, just to be able to read, focus on what was going on the screen or what was going on in my books.
Wow. And I understand too, you had to take some time over the summer too, just to catch up, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. For the 2 months that I had missed.
Okay. So you were able to continue medical school and then you graduated in 2019, I believe. So what happened after that? What was your kind of plan and where are you now?
Well, I had always planned to work out of a Cree community. It's just, growing up in the region where I grew up, to me, it was kind of like a natural plan. I had always planned to be in one of our communities or at least nearby one of the communities. I had never really planned on living down south, for example. So what I did is I looked around in terms of residency options and had put basically Timmins location of Timmins first under the Northern Ontario School of Medicine because I knew that that would allow me to work kind of like in a region that's similar to Northern Quebec as well. That would give me access to a large enough French Canadian and Cree population that would allow me to do some placements in Cree communities. And I picked as a second choice actually Val d'Or because Val d'Or is a similar location in Quebec, just 4 hours east, with a similar kind of population with access to Cree communities. So I had those two as my options, and basically I got my first option, which was Timmins, and finished my residency over there, only to move on to working for the Cree Health Board as soon as I graduated.
Where are you right now?
So yeah, so I work for the Cree. I work for the Cree Health Board in Quebec. As I said, out of Oujé-Bougoumou. So basically, I'm the assistant chief medical officer. So the way it works in the Cree Health Board is that you have a chief medical officer, and then for every community, you have an assistant chief medical officer who kind of helps organize the medical services for each clinic. So I'm the assistant chief medical officer for the Oujé-Bougoumou Healing Center.
Oh wow. Congratulations. So so what is that like for you? Are you happy where you are? And what are some of the challenges that you face in terms of being able to, help your communities?
Well, it's not dictionary making, I could tell you that. I mean, dictionary making is such a calm endeavor. It almost feels like picking blueberries. You're working on one word at a time, and you get a little sense of satisfaction every time you enter one word. You have an elder sitting next to you, or you're working through some texts, some stories, or some audio recordings. But medicine is very different. Medicine obviously. In a small community like Oujé-Bougoumou, not only do you, when you're working, not only are you, running a regular clinic from 9 to 5 with scheduled appointments, but you have to handle the walk-in clinic, which on occasion will include some, emergencies, which you kind of have to drop everything and you have to deal with the emergency and a possible transfer to a hospital. And beyond that, when we are working in the clinics, we're on call 24/7. So 5 o'clock, most people go home, have supper, see their kids, watch a TV show. Whereas the doctors in small communities like Oujé-Bougoumou are basically on call all night. So, you get called on occasion, 3 a.m., for example. You got to deal with somebody presenting with chest pain, for example. And you got to get up and head to the clinic and perhaps organize a transfer to a hospital. So it's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding work. There's a lot of needs in our communities, of course, and a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the health situation, the health conditions that we're dealing with, or the as you would say, the morbidity that we find in Cree communities in terms of medical conditions is, largely a result of the residential school system and the intergenerational trauma that results from that. So this is what we're trying to, deal with and what we manage from day to day. But it does come with a lot of challenges because a lot of the conditions, regardless of whether or not they seem like, for example, physical conditions like diabetes, a lot of the times do have, a mental health component. There's a reason why we are doing the way we are doing, the reason why we are faring the way we are faring, as Cree people nowadays. And so I'm a strong believer that a lot of the conditions that we're dealing with, whether it's high blood pressure or diabetes, does have a mental health component deep down inside. So it's tough for sure.
So while you continue to do that, like you're still working, with linguistics and the dictionary. So I know you've been working with Moose Cree First Nation, developing their dictionaries. They're they just released their fourth edition, and you just recently released your own dictionary called Lexical Roots of Old Cree and Etymological Dictionary. So can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the Moose Cree project. I mean, as you recall, I mentioned when I graduated from my master's, I had sent out some letters to various organizations trying to see if I can, if they're interested in creating a position or creating a contract to help them with their language work. And Geraldine Governor at Moose Cree First Nation, who was the director of the Department of Language and Culture, reached out to me in 2012, asking me some questions about what it would take to put together a Moose Cree dictionary. The interesting thing about Moose Cree is that for those on the east, those who aren't on the East Coast who may not know, the Moose Cree dialect is kind of the liturgical language on the East Coast. Most communities, at least the Southern Cree communities on the East Coast, for perhaps over 100 years. Basically, when we were in church as kids, it was the Moose Cree the Moose Cree Bible that was used. The prayers are read in the Moose Cree language. To this day, we have elders who will speak the East Cree dialect, but as soon as a public prayer is needed, they stand up and they pray in Moose Cree. There's tons of literature, well, mostly religious literature, since that has been created since the 1850s in the Moose Cree dialect. But to this day, until 2012, I should say, no dictionary had ever been produced for the dialect, which is kind of shocking when you consider the importance of the dialect. And so Geraldine and I had spoken about creating a project, and she found some funding, and basically she handled the administrative part from the very beginning. Was a staunch supporter of the work. We hurried up, I believe, I don't know if it was the next year, a couple years later, and produced a tiny, like a very small first edition, just to show the kind of the community and the band council what we were trying to do and where we were heading. And it really garnered a lot of support. And here we are, 4 editions later. We're at the fourth edition. We have a website. The Moose Cree Dictionary is the largest dictionary of any Cree dialect ever published. It's a monumental work. It's beautiful. It's a community effort. We had many elders. I don't have the list in front of me, but many elders participated in this project since 2012. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of these elders over the years. And it's a systematic review of the language. We sat down and we reviewed, like, much of the literature. There's still a lot to be done, but we went through much of the literature, spent countless hours working with the elders, just trying to capture the language, recording natural speech and analyzing the speech to make sure that the senses, the use of the words, the use of the language was represented in an accurate way. So I'm really proud of that work. The other dictionary you're mentioning, which is a dictionary of Old Cree, as you said, is an etymological dictionary that was just published last year. That is more of a theoretical approach to linguistics, in the sense that it's a reconstruction of the ancestral form of the Cree language. So we call this proto-language reconstruction. So to give you an example, outside of the Cree language, all the languages of Europe, for example, except for the Basque language, of course, but English, French, Italian, Spanish, German, these languages all derive ultimately from what linguists theorize is the Proto-Indo-European language. So does Farsi, for example, the majority language in Iran. We're talking about war with Iran right now and the news, and Iranians speak a language that's actually related to English and French, and most people don't know this. So the idea is that by systematically comparing the various languages and the various dialects and their grammatical features and their phonological features, using what we call the comparative method, there's a way to kind of reconstruct the what would have been the most probable ancestral form that over time, through what we call regular language change, would have led to the development of the various languages and the various dialects. So I basically did this work for the Cree language. We started with I basically started by compiling all the data from the dialects that I had been working on in terms of collecting data over the past 20 years, which is basically all the dialects on the East Coast, some of the dialects on the Côte Nord of Quebec, the North Shore of Quebec, sorry. I worked on Swampy Cree in Ontario. I worked on the R dialect in Quebec as well, and Moose Cree. Started comparing the forms, and then basically I expanded from there and started incorporating dictionaries and historical documents from other dialects all the way back to the 1600s. So the work basically covered dialects from Alberta all the way to Labrador, and allowed me to arrive at the reconstruction of Proto-Cree, basically, which I termed Old Cree for this particular work, just to make it a little bit more accessible to a non-linguist. So that's why I called the language Old Cree. So it's a root dictionary. When you open it, you're not going to find words; you're going to find roots. So if I can give an example to your listeners right now, for example, if we take a word like, if for example, trying to think of a word that would work in on both sides of the coast, but if you were to say something like Oujé-Bougoumou, Oujé-Bougoumou, it means a crest of sand, a sandy crest. Then the root Oujé would be found in a dictionary, and it would explain that Oujé means, a crest or some kind of a ridge. And you can form all kinds of words with this particular root, for example, Uche Yagunagao, and which would work on both sides as well of the coast, meaning a crest of snow or a ridge of snow, for example. Or so basically by comparing all the dialects, we're able to come down to a reconstruction of every particular root that is used for producing or constructing words in a language. So that's that dictionary. There's been a few other dictionaries that I've published. We've published a dictionary of fauna and flora for the east coast of James Bay. So that was a dictionary that was based on field work that I did in 2010, where I interviewed about 60 elders from the various communities on the east coast of James Bay, and really having a systematic approach at trying to find the names of the birds and the plants and the animals and the insects. Where I had images, and I had created these surveys, basically using field guides and ensuring that every single bird that had a range within the Cree territory was represented in the surveys, and basically interviewing elders over hours at a time, just to make sure that we capture all the words. So that was a lot of work, and we have a beautiful edition that's been published of that book, where we actually hired an artist that works basically an artist that draws basically, draws illustrations of animals and birds and such for books like National Geographic magazine and field guides for different companies. So it's a really nice field guide for the fauna and flora of the region in the East Cree dialect.
And I understand just going back to the lexical roots of Old Cree, for example, that took 2 decades of research, I believe.
Yeah, well, like I said, I've been collecting words in the various dialects, and it's not a this is not like a little, Of course, it's a hobby of mine, but it was a systematic effort. I would sit down with elders, often with a recorder, often with a set of very detailed questions. So I have tons and tons of data on the various dialects in Ontario and Quebec that I had just been gathering, including the Anishinaabe dialect, as I said, the Algonquin dialect in northern Quebec. And so that's really where the start came from, because when you realize how many dialects are spoken in a close, in close proximity, my great grandmother, for example, spoke, everybody in my family says my great grandmother spoke Moose Cree. It didn't sound like Waswanipi Cree. And right next door to Waswanipi is a community called Oujé-Bougoumou. Oujé-Bougoumou is our dialect community. So it sounds like Moose Cree, except they have R's that kind of like the Spanish R, as opposed to an L. That's right next door. I have cousins in that community, and then directly to the north, we have Waskaganish, which speaks a slightly different dialect as well. So, in close proximity, we have all these dialects. And being the inquisitive person that I am as a younger person, I was like, what is the difference between all these dialects? And of course, that naturally leads. I don't know if you remember a little earlier, I mentioned how I would be reading the roots of Proto-Indo-European, the index and at the end of the English dictionary, and finding it fascinating how scholars would be able to propose these ancestral forms for the English language. And that naturally led to me being interested in the same thing for the Cree language.
Hmm. Yeah. So in that book about Cree, there's and you have the chart of all just the phonemes, which is the basic sounds like the vowels and the consonants, and then when you get to the one where we get the differences in the different dialects. So Old Cree has the R one, and there's the N for the Swampy Cree, L for the Moose Cree, and so on. So how how does each dialect evolve? Like how did they evolve to become different dialects?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it does seem, to a person who's not looking at it systematically, it seems kind of random, oh, they have an L. Why do they have an L? And in fact, it leads to, the misunderstanding of this leads to a lot of mistakes when people try to imitate another dialect. So I'll give you a simple example. On the west coast of James Bay, you have an N where Moose Factory might have an L, but Moose Factory also has an N. So a common mistake is when people on the West Coast try to speak like Moose Cree, they changed all their N's to an L. A simple example is, for example, let me just think of a word, like Nadam, Nadam, he or Najiptao, Najiptao, he or Najipto, sorry, he runs to get it,
Hmm.
a person from the West Coast might pronounce it Lajipto, trying to imitate Moose Cree. Oh, Moose Cree people say Lajipto, which is false. Moose Cree say Najipto. Of course, for any listeners here, I pronounce the words obviously through a filter of my own dialect, so don't hang me on a cross for 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 the accentuation is a bit different in Waswanipi Cree compared to Moose Cree and Swampy Cree. But that's basically the idea is that the people have a hard time understanding this because they'll say things like, "Oh, Moose Cree has an L, so therefore they must not have an N," which is false. So the idea is that when you compare this, so if you were to compare, for example, Swampy Cree with Moose Cree, you say, okay, Swampy Cree has N's everywhere, where Moose Cree has N's and L's. And then if you were to compare that to Waswanipi Cree, you say, okay, Waswanipi Cree has N's and Y's. And so that the Y's, but then the other thing is Moose Factory also has Y's. So Moose Factory has N's, L's, and Y's. Waswanipi has N's and Y's. And Swampy Cree has N and Y. So by comparing systematically, you find out that, okay, every single Y that Moose Factory has is the same thing in Swampy Cree and in Waswanipi Cree. They're all Y's. But then there are some L's in Moose. All the L's in Moose Cree are also Y's in Waswanipi. So you kind of deduce that, okay, the L must be an older consonant, so to speak. I'm just not using linguistic terms here, but to simplify for the listeners. But the L must have been an older form because there is no way to derive it from Swampy Cree nor from Waswanipi Cree. So if I were to take all the Y's in Waswanipi and change them all to L's, I would get a butchered language that nobody would understand. And if you were to take all the N's in Swampy Cree and change them all to L's, you would get another butchered language nobody would understand. So the only way to derive the L is to say, well, it must be an older form that Swampy Cree. You can derive Swampy Cree from Moose Cree. You can change all the L's in Moose Cree to N's, and you get Swampy Cree. And so to speak, I'm simplifying it here. There are slight other differences, but and you could do the same thing to Waswanipi Cree. You could say I take all the L's in Moose Cree and change them all to Y's, and I get something that's much more akin to Waswanipi Cree, with a few exceptions as well, like I said. So by systematically comparing like that, you can see that, okay, hold on a second. These changes are systematic. They happen across the language, and the only way to really understand in which direction the change happened is by always going back towards in the direction of which dialect has the most variety of consonants. So Moose Factory has more consonants than Swampy Cree or Waswanipi Cree, for example. And so the fact that it has more consonants suggests that it's an older form. I mean, this is a simplification of it, but it kind of is the way that it works. And in fact, you can do this when you start comparing across other dialects. You start seeing that this is in fact true. So you go to the R dialect and you realize, oh, hold on a second. The R dialect has an N, has a Y, has an R, and that the R corresponds to the Moose Cree L. So this kind of backs up the argument. Okay, this makes sense.
Hmm.
And then you go back to historical records all the way to the 1600s, and you find out that the further back you go, the more accurate this seems to be. That the R was there historically, that the N was there historically, and that the Y was there historically. So something happens as people, through time, as people move around, and as people influence each other, for whatever reason, an R will change into an L. And in fact, if you were to pronounce the R and the L, and just pay attention to the placement in your mouth of where your tongue kind of hits your teeth, you realize that the R and the L actually hit your teeth. Your tongue hits your teeth at the exact same place. So there isn't much difference between a da 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 versus a la 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 la. So you say, okay, that's not a complicated change. You could see why some people might have slightly changed the pronunciation. In fact, it makes me think of Japanese. You know how Japanese speakers kind of don't really hear the difference between an L and an R, and actually will pronounce, an L or R back and forth, in the same word. So you can kind of see how Cree speakers back in the days didn't really hear the difference between an L and an R, and how the L would have derived from the R or vice versa. But then you get to the point of, okay, why would it have become an N? Why did an L or an R become an N? Well, again, at the same time, if you were to pronounce the L or the R, la, 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 and then you pronounce an N, a na, 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 they're all pronounced at the same place on the teeth. The only difference is that an N, you do something with your nasal cavity to kind of give it a nasal sound. But all these sounds are actually pronounced in similar places in the mouth. So you can see how change is not that drastic. When we think of, oh, it's an N, oh, it's an L, oh, it's an R, these sounds are all closely related. They're all pronounced, we call it the point of articulation in linguistics. The point of articulation of all three sounds is quite similar. We have they call it a TH dialect out west, the Woods Cree dialect, but their TH sound, again, is that TH sound, the, is pronounced the same place in the mouth as the L, as the R, and as the N. So the point of articulation of all these sounds is the same. The difference is the what we call the manner of articulation. So where an R would be called a flap, you really feel your tongue flapping, and the L is a liquid. It feels like more like like air is passing softly around your tongue. This is a manner of articulation. So the dialects are not that different. The dialects are pretty similar, and you can kind of see how over time, as people become isolated, a group of our ancestors kind of moved towards another lake and maybe didn't have so much contact with the neighboring group for a couple decades or maybe a generation or something, and slowly the pronunciation kind of just changes in one direction versus another, and this is how language change happens. I mean, it happens to every language on earth. A simple example is how in Ontario, the English in Ontario, for whatever reason, this is something we noticed when we moved in Ontario because my daughter picked up the accent from Ontario. But if you say something like bed, in Quebec, bed, my bed, the English speakers in Ontario almost make that sound, that s sound like a ah, like they'll say my bad,
Oh, okay.
So I can't approximate it well, but it's very, very obvious when you come from Quebec and you have a distinct sound and you listen to English speakers in Ontario, and it's like, wow, why are you saying bad? It's not bad. No, they're not saying. I'm not saying bad. I'm saying bad. It's like, but you're not. It sounds like you're saying bad. So it's a funny thing that people notice when they move from one region to another, that the accent changes a little bit. And what that means when we say accent is, vowels, but consonants change a little bit, and that's what happened with the Cree language.
I never noticed that, that difference. In these terms, how would you describe the difference between Cree and English, like from a linguistic perspective? Because I find like little literal translations are pretty difficult, and like the syntax can be a bit different, like where the how the words are arranged in the sentence. So, just as a couple of examples, so how would you describe the difference between Cree and English?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, and it's actually quite fascinating. I'll try not to overwhelm the listeners with too much linguistics jargon, but and maybe try to give some examples of what I mean. But it's different in quite a few ways. But the most jarring difference is that Cree has something we call a polysynthetic structure. Polysynthetic structure, to kind of explain it in simple terms, is the notion that a word in the Cree language or in other languages that have polysynthetic structures, the word will actually be formed by multiple components, none of which make sense on their own. You can't use these components on their own, but they are necessarily built upon, the words are necessarily built by sticking many of these pieces together. So I said a while ago, I gave you an example of Oujé-Bougoumou, meaning, there's a ridge of sand, for example. That word, is composed of Oujé, which is the first component, which means a ridge, and a dauk, which is a component that means sand, which actually historically is composed of two other components, but that component means sand. Then this a sound, which actually transforms that whole word into a verb, an inanimate intransitive verb. And then the conjugation at the end, which is a W, which signals that it's a third person and is singular. So then we get ushe, a dauk, a u, and we get ushe daukao. So minimally, this word has four components, and this is what we mean by polysynthetic. Whereas English is there's examples of that where you might say something like the word conventional, which historically, maybe from Latin as a borrowing from Latin has multiple components, but I mean in English it's just one word. Convention. You put the adjective, the adverbial ending "ol" at the end, or the adverb. I mean the adjectival suffix "al" at the end, which gives you conventional, and then you may put a prefix at the end, unconventional. So now you have three components that kind of forms that word. But this is kind of like more of the exception. And in fact, it happens more with words that are not even of English origin. Like in this case, this is like a Latin borrowing. But if you were just to speak English using purely, words that are purely from the Old English language, you're saying sentences like "I jump," "I jump to." I jump to you, for example. So we have four words here, and they're all separated one from the other. I being its own word, jump being its own word, to being its own word, you being its own word. So it's strikingly different from Cree, where a sentence like that could be said in one word. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the main difference between, at least the most striking difference between Cree versus English. So where you can say you can step outside in the morning and say, "Wow, look at the snowy landscape! It's so beautiful," And in Cree, you would just say that in one word. In Moose Cree, we'd say "Milaganagao," or in your dialect, "Minoaganagao." In my dialect, "Miaganagao." That's one word. It has one, two, three, four components, but it literally means there is a beautiful expanse of snow. So that often causes difficulty for translators who are maybe not consciously aware of this. Like a lot of translation happens kind of unconsciously and spontaneously, right? You hear one person talking, you just kind of say it as quickly as you can in the other language. But a lot of the nuance in the Korean language, and a lot of the the to sound like you're speaking the language in a native kind of way, in a natural kind of way, requires that you take advantage of this particular kind of grammatical, this particular kind of feature of the language. And so sometimes, when you walk into a hospital and you see translations on signs, or you read a government paper where they paid somebody to translate something in Cree, a lot of the awkwardness comes from the fact that they're translating the English into Cree word for word, and don't make use of this natural feature of our language, which ends up making things sound very, very strange. So that's probably the biggest barrier for people trying to learn a language, is that when you speak a language that is more, as I mentioned, English is a little bit more isolating. The words are isolated one from the other. When you speak a language that is a little bit more isolating in terms of typology, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around a language that's less isolating, that's more polysynthetic or even synthetic on that scale. So, there are other languages on earth that are like this. In fact, most Native American languages are polysynthetic, but there are languages that are more towards that end of the continuum, in terms, if you were to imagine a continuum of isolating languages being on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum being polysynthetic languages, and a range of languages somewhere in the middle. You have Mandarin, I should say. Mandarin is highly isolating. Every single syllable is like its own word separated from each other. And then somewhere in the middle, you have something like Japanese. Japanese is much more synthetic. There's a lot of similarities in how the structure of Japanese words. There's a lot of similarities between the structure of Japanese words and the structure of Cree words, for example. I don't mean that they're related. I just mean that the typology, the synthesis of the words is similar.
Mm.
Turkish, for example, is a much more synthetic language. So the words kind of take multiple parts. And then way on the other end, you have words like a Cree language, for example, way on the other end of the polysynthetic structure. The languages of Mexico, Native American languages in Mexico, like the Aztec language, which we call Nahuatl, is one of these polysynthetic languages, for example.
Wow.
So this is this you can grade you can kind of place all languages on Earth somewhere on this spectrum. And unfortunately, for those of us who grew up speaking European languages like English and French, that we're kind of further on the isolating spectrum, which makes it very difficult to pick up polysynthetic languages. But it's very easy for polysynthetic language speakers to pick up isolating languages. So Cree speakers, we routinely see elderly speakers, when elderly Cree people who never went to school and who picked up English or who picked up French. I knew an elder. His name was Fred Moat. He was he was an Abitibi, basically a man from Abitibi Lake, who had settled in Picogan with his wife many years ago, and who had picked up, without ever being sent to residential school, had picked up English, had picked up French, and had told me that he was in the process of picking up Italian. He had been hired by an Italian prospector and told him, "Speak to me in Italian. I want to learn your language as well." And he says that contract only lasted a week because the guy received a message that his contract had been canceled. So he says, if I had stayed with that guy all summer, I would have picked up Italian. But this old man spoke Algonquin, spoke Cree, both of them fluently, and had managed to pick up English and French fluently without ever going to school.
One thing I'm struggling with, or I'm learning right now in terms of my learning of Cree, is yeah, all the verb conjugations, because you have to differentiate between like the animate, inanimate, and whether it's transitive or intransitive. Like, are there a lot of languages like that?
Yeah, actually, there are some similarities with English there. I think it's just there's something about the way English is taught in school where we don't. I don't know about Ontario, but at least in Quebec, it's not like we focus strongly on grammar when we're teaching, when we're being taught English in school. We just assume you speak English, and so what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to read and write, but we're not really being told about the internal structure of the language. But of course, there are transitive verbs in English, and there are intransitive verbs in English, for example, but it's simplified by the fact that the form of the verb doesn't really change. So I'll give you an example. I drink tea. Drink is a transitive verb in that particular case. It requires an object. I drink tea. But you can take the same verb and make it an intransitive verb and just say, I drink. Do you drink? Yeah, I drink. And in that case, it's an intransitive verb because it does not require an object. So that kind of complicates things in terms of trying to learn Cree, because the examples in English are not super striking. But for French language speakers, French being much more complex verbally, there's a lot more verb conjugations in French. We learn by rote memorization in French school. So actually, when you start looking at the verb, what you're talking about, the verb paradigms, for example, for the Cree language, if you've been to French school, it's very similar to the way we've learned in French. So most French speakers will tell you, will take a verb and they're able to conjugate it in this order. They'll say something like, I drink, you drink, he drinks, we drink, you drink, they drink. This is like the rote memorization that French speakers learn in school. And really, when you look at the Cree structure, that's kind of how we have to think about learning it. You have to kind of see it as a template, and you just have to learn how to say "Niminikon, Giminikon, Miniko, Niminikonan." That's kind of how you have to go about it. Otherwise, it's just overwhelming if you don't kind of spend the time to do that as a second language learner, I should say. But yeah, I mean, most languages have these types of distinctions. These are basic grammatical distinctions, transitive versus intransitive verb, whether it takes an object or not. This is a common thing across languages. The inanimate versus animate. This is a very common thing across languages as well. And historically, the English language had had something similar as well. So the English language kind of simplified in that way over the centuries. But the Old English language would have had something similar as well. The French language does. This is called grammatical gender. So the French language has, feminine versus masculine. Does it mean that the object is literally feminine or literally masculine? No, these are grammatical terms. It's just basically the language has two types of nouns and they're categorized. You could have called it, noun class one, noun class two, adjective class one, adjective class two. But somebody at some point said, well, look, when you talk about women, you say the word women in French, femme, it's class one and it takes all these adjectives. And when you say which means man, it takes class two, all these other adjectives. So they ended up calling it feminine and masculine based on that distinction. It's the same thing in Cree. So in Cree, you might say, nabil is takes these types of conjugations. So we're going to call it animate because a man is alive. And then we say a ski. A ski takes all these types of conjugations and all these types of words. So we're going to call it inanimate because Earth is not alive, like it's not moving. So that's where the terms came from. It doesn't mean alive and not alive. There are things that are not alive that are technically animate grammatically, and there are things that are probably alive that are called inanimate. I mean, we talk about the earth. The earth is probably teeming with bacteria, but we call it inanimate. So it's important not to get too caught up with these words. Animate versus inanimate. It's really just a grammatical distinction. It's a noun class one versus noun class two. Simple example: ice is animate in Cree, and water is inanimate. There's no rhyme or reason around these things. A spoon is animate for whatever reason, and a fork is inanimate. So these are the kind of things like you don't want to think too much about it. It's over time, these kind of grammatical classifications just happen naturally. It happens in most languages. It's not something that's really special to the Cree language. Most languages on earth have some kind of grammatical gender, and you just kind of have to memorize which nouns fall on which in which gender. That's about it.
Like maybe this is when you first started studying linguistics, but when did you first start going your Cree learning like in earnest? Was that when you started studying linguistics? And how would you describe your level of fluency right now?
I've always tried to learn some Cree. Of course, as a kid, it was like, Mom, what does that mean? Mom, I want to tell Gokum this. How do I say this? So I mean, it wasn't really like structured or very, very focused. Then I would say, when my aunt Louisa bought me my first Cree dictionary, I would say that that's when I really started trying to think systematically about the language and how to put the language together. I was lucky around 17 or 16 years old, maybe no, around 17 years old or 18 years old. I was dating a girl whose aunt was actually a language teacher. So I was lucky enough to sit down with her, and she would kind of make me go through some exercises. So that was really helpful. That was Sarah Mark Stewart. So thank you, Sarah, for those lessons. And then around 19 years old or 18 years old, I was living in Waswanipi. I was living actually with my grandmother. So whether or not I wanted to learn Cree, you kind of have no choice but to pick something up, because when your grandmother is telling you to go get some cat food, you got to bring back cat food, or else she won't be happy. So yeah, you kind of pick some up there as well. But I had another teacher in Waswanipi. Her name was Lenny. She actually had worked with elders back in the days, actually doing similar type of work as I was doing, collecting verb conjugations and such. She worked for the Cree School Board, was a local translator for many years. She's retired now. But I managed. She was very generous with her time as well. So I would go sit with her nearly every day for half an hour or so, just going through verb conjugations and asking her like a tons of questions. And then of course going home and then having no choice but to sit down with my grandma, of course, and have supper and just try to understand what she was telling me every day. So I would say that that's really where the bulk of my learning happened. And then over the years, just doing the work that I do, sitting with the elders, my mother was, super generous with her time whenever I had questions about the language. It could be an hour long chat over the phone about all kinds of very specific things that I wanted to know. So she's always been very, very generous. And my mother is, like I said, was sent to residential school much later than a lot of other children. So in that sense, she really retained the language strongly. So I was really lucky. I was fortunate about that fact. So that's really how my language learning kind of happened. And it continues. The Cree language it is complex. Especially like I said with the polysynthetic structure and the verb conjugations. Like there are so many verb conjugations. Every once in a while, I hear a word I never heard. And of course I jump into like very active learning mode and start calling everybody and say, how do you use that word? How do you use that word? I'm trying to really understand the concept and its nuances. So it does happen still to this day. How would I classify my level of Cree? I mean, I work in a Cree community. Many of my elderly patients prefer or sometimes have no choice but to speak Cree with me. So, I mean, I'm able to hold medical interviews in Cree. I'm able to serve in emergencies in Cree. I know an elderly person comes in with chest pain. I'm able to do all the questioning in Cree and, explain everything in Cree, explain the medication in Cree. So I believe that people watching me would consider me fluent. But it's a funny fact about polysynthetic languages. We never quite feel fluent enough. Another linguist remarked this, was talking about this particular fact about polysynthetic language speakers, but it's the language is so complex. And she was saying, you're in a community where everybody is speaking the language. And then you ask them, wow, you speak really well. And the first thing they'll tell you is, I don't speak that well. I wish I could speak better. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, you just sat here speaking for an hour, with the, yeah, but I don't speak that well. it's something about the structure of our language that always has us second guessing our competence. Like there's something we could improve about it because we heard Elder Hilda Jeffries talking, and oh my God, Hilda Jeffries is using all these complex words that I never heard. Or I heard Mr. Charlie Bosom in Oujé-Bougoumou talking and using all these fancy words, and I formulate words and sentences like that. So it's something about the structure of our language that always has us kind of second guessing ourselves, which is when you speak a language like English. I mean, you can come from another country. It could be the third language you learn. You spend a few months in Montreal or Ottawa, and next thing you know, you're speaking English, and you're working in Ottawa and you're speaking English. Albeit with a maybe with an accent, but you're fluent. So it's something about the Cree language that always makes you feel like you don't really have a full grasp of it. So I would say I probably am a fluent speaker, but I always feel like there's something I'm missing or that I'm supposed to understand or something I need to learn.
So, what advice would you have for other learners on how to go about learning Cree?
It's really important. It really is important to memorize I don't mean every single conjugation table, but you should really spend some time memorizing conjugation tables, how to conjugate. I'll use my dialect now because I don't want to make mistakes as I'm speaking in Cree. But if you really want to learn, you have to be able to say, for example, if you're talking about sleep, you have to be able to say ninaban, jinaban, nibao, ninabanan, jinabanano, jinabanao, nibawich. You have to be able to do that. And in the different forms, enabayan, enabayan, enabat, enabayach. You have to be able to conjugate your verbs because the Cree language is highly verbal. I'll give you a simple example. If you say something like, kitchen in English, go to the kitchen. In most Cree dialects, speakers will prefer not to use nouns in these types of situations. They will often say, go to where the food is cooked. And if you don't know how to conjugate verbs, you cannot form those types of phrases, and you cannot understand those types of phrases. So it's a feature of the Cree language that whenever a verb form can be used instead of a noun form, the verb form tends to be used. Even though the noun exists, this happens a lot in the language, a lot. There's a noun that exists and the people just ignore it and they'll just use the verb form. So you really have to learn to master verb forms, how to conjugate the verb forms. Putting words together and being fancy, like I was saying earlier, the polysynthetic structure, this is something you can learn over time. But if you don't have the verb conjugations, you can't even put a phrase together really in the Cree language. So unfortunately, resources are not always easily accessible, but I would say to the speakers on the West Coast, there are quite a few good resources. The Moose Cree Dictionary has a full set of verb conjugation tables inside of the fourth edition. So that's probably the easiest place to go. If you and it probably, the verb conjugation tables probably align with the Swampy Cree dialect as well, the N dialect as well. So if you are a speaker in Attawapskat or Biwanik, they're probably adequate for you. If not, there's, C. Douglas Ellis has produced some language books that have some conjugation tables in them. They don't fully match the Moose Cree dialect in Moose Factory, but they do match the dialect in Albany, so that's a useful tool as well. The Plains Cree dialect out west, for those who are out west listening, the Itoewin dictionary, you can just search Itoewin online for the Plains Cree dictionary. If you click on verbs, you can get all the conjugation tables as well. No, but that's a really important thing to do. And just one of the unfortunate facts about that Cree learners often complain about is this feeling that people will giggle or laugh when they make mistakes and make them feel like inadequate or make them feel silly for even trying to speak the language. And I really encourage those who do speak Cree, encourage those who are trying to learn the language. The language is dying. I don't have much hope that in 3 or 4 generations, there will be, young kids fluent and whole communities speaking the language. Like, the fact of the matter is that the use is dwindling in every single community. So when a speaker is showing interest in learning the language, encourage them. Don't giggle, don't laugh. If they make a mistake, correct them kindly. I think that's really important. If we're going to create the sorts of environments necessary to encourage people to pick up the language, it's going to be through kindness. And it's a really important thing for us speakers to really encourage those who are trying to learn to actually feel comfortable enough to speak it in public. We have a whole generation of people in every community who are what we call kind of passive speakers of the Korean language, who understand everything but who just won't speak. And when you ask them why, they'll say, I don't know, I just don't feel like I speak well. but they understand everything. So to those speakers out there who feel like you understand well, the elders are speaking and you're able to understand, and you feel the urge to respond in English, you're a really really useful and valuable part of our community, in terms of language retention and language learning. So try to speak the language. We need you. We need those of you who actually understand the language to make a little bit more of an effort to speak it, so that those of us who don't understand it all actually have more resources, can actually, have more practice. It's hard to pick up a language when we don't hear it, you know? This is why people, you go to Mexico for 2 weeks and you come out speaking some Spanish. You're like, 'cause that's all you hear. And unfortunately, too often nowadays in most Cree communities, you can walk around the Cree community all day and barely hear a Cree word. So, speaking the language is really important. We need to create these immersive environments where people just hear the language and are encouraged to pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
And those are my thoughts.
Okay. Is there anything else we could be doing, like at the community level, like in terms of programming or what we do in schools or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a wonderful approach that was created by the Maori in New Zealand, called language nests. The idea of a language nest is that you place a young child, or it could even be a teenager, even or even an adult. But the idea is you place the young children in the presence of monolingual speakers, or even in the presence of bilingual speakers, people who do speak English. But the idea is they don't speak English around the children, right? And the idea is you create 100% immersive environment in children that are very young. The reason for this is because young children do not learn a language. This is a misconception. You don't learn to speak Cree when you're 4 or 5 years old. You acquire it in the same way that you acquire the ability to walk. Like, nobody taught you how to walk. You didn't have to go through, okay, lesson one today. You got to take your left foot and take a step. People just acquire walking. It's biologically innate, and by 2 years old, you're running around. So the same thing happens for language. We have to start learning a language when we start hitting our teenage years. For whatever reason, it's almost like the acquisition part, it's like it's past. The acquisition happens when you're very young. And if you don't acquire it when you're young, then you have to spend the extra time, the extra effort to learn the language. And so by trying to take advantage of that, we can create fluent speakers who can carry the language into the next generation. And the simple, easiest way to do that is by creating these language nests, by creating the type of social structure, whether it's in a daycare or whether it's just, what, I'm just gonna ask Gokum to just only speak Cree to the child. And every Sunday I bring my child there and I leave her there with Gokum for 4 hours, or for grandpa, I bring him to grandpa for 4 hours. The idea is to create an immersive environment for young children to just acquire the language. And because really the language, every language on earth is maintained at home in the family. This is how languages are maintained. Sure, you could learn just second language, at school, but it's never the same as a native language, a language that you learn as a mother tongue in the home. So by creating these environments, you're creating a chance for the language to actually continue as a native language, as a mother tongue. So I really like this idea of language nests, and I'm not saying it. We have to model it exactly on how they're doing it over there, but the idea is to try to increase the number of immersive experiences in the language as communities. This is something that we can throw funding at. We can create programs. Band councils can try to fund this, but even just on an individual level, is trying to create more of these immersive environments for children, young children.
Mm-hmm. That seems to come up time and again. Is immersion is the best way.
Yeah.
So that's it for my questions. Is there anything else you wanted to add that we haven't talked about that maybe you wanted to?
I really appreciate this time to talk about the language. I'm passionate about the language. I've made a big effort with my youngest child. Actually, I made a decision in my own family where, when I realized that my children were not really picking up the language, just living in a Cree community amongst other children, I realized that most children were not speaking the language anymore, which was, quite a difference compared to when I was young. I made a decision in my own family to speak Cree to my youngest one. So I have a 13-year-old daughter who speaks, her speaks Cree, speaks English, speaks French, and also speaks my wife's language. My wife speaks Arabic fluently and only speaks Arabic to my children. So you can make this kind of decision. If you're a speaker of the language and you're seeing that your kids are not speaking Cree, you can make a decision. You could say, okay, you know what? From now on, I'm just speaking Cree, and it's not as hard as you may think. It's difficult the first few days, maybe the first few weeks, where you find yourself kind of like, depending on half Cree, half English words, like, oh, how do we say that again? But you call an elder, you call a family or a family friend, a family member or friend. How do we say that again in Cree? What's the proper word? And then just take that English word out of your Cree and start using the Cree. The point is that kids naturally will assimilate the language. They'll naturally learn the language, and that's really what we need to do is making those. If everybody did what they can based on their own kind of level of fluency, we would see great gains in the community. Not everybody is as fluent as everybody else. Not everybody is as comfortable as everybody else. But if everybody made their own effort in their own way, I really think that we can get somewhere. And so I'm encouraging everybody who has some fluency, either passive learners or people who are fluent speakers and who just don't really speak it in the home. Like, make an effort, do your part, and I really think that we can win together. We can keep the language alive. I want to thank you for today's interview. I really appreciate having a chance to talk about the language. Those of you out there who don't have a copy of the fourth edition of the Moose Cree Dictionary, it's a really beautiful, beautiful dictionary. We're really proud of it. It's a community effort. I encourage you to get yourselves a copy of it and keep spreading the word. Keep working at keeping this language alive. It's a beautiful part of our heritage.
So that was my conversation with Kevin Brousseau. Very fascinating, and you can hear the passion that he has for the language and for linguistics. He's also a very humble guy, and all my correspondence with him, like, he never mentioned his title, that he's a doctor. In my first email to him, I was like, "Hi, Dr. Brousseau." And when he replied, he just signed off as Kevin. And never once did he ever say Dr. Kevin Brousseau or anything like that. So, very humble guy. And you can hear it in as he tells his story. I appreciated him explaining the complexity of Cree compared to English. Makes me feel a bit more better about my own progress. And I felt silly asking him to describe his fluency, especially after I asked it, because this is a guy that made Cree dictionaries. I think in part I was projecting my own insecurities about my progress, but also my pronunciation as a second language learner of Cree. But I appreciated how he said a lot of fluent speakers say they don't feel fluent, which brought me back to what my uncle and my dad used to say, and how their father, my Mushum, had a advanced vocabulary. Like, I remember my dad saying, "Oh, I forgot what my dad said the word is for that species of bird there. There's a word," and he's trying to remember it, and there's other kinds of terms. And I remember my brother, too, who grew up in Albany, with my gukum, and he's saying there's a word, she said, for this type of like plateau, like on a bank by the river. There's a word for it. I forget what it is, and things like that. So, yeah, I guess we always feel that we have much to learn. Like, if the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? That type of thing. So, yeah, that was a really interesting and fun conversation with Kevin Brousseau. So again, you can order his book, Lexical Roots of Old Cree, an etymological dictionary from the University of Ottawa Press. You can also find it on Amazon and Indigo. You can also go to oldcree.com to find what I imagine to be most of the entries should be on there. You can get a copy of the Moose Cree Dictionary, their fourth edition, by going to moosecree.ca, or you can contact Geraldine Govender at geraldine.govender@moosecree.com. You can also find Kevin's blog at creelanguage.wordpress.com for stories, grammar lessons, and other interesting tidbits. So for the next month, I'm going to take my flashcards and my Moose Cree Dictionary to camp. I'm sure I'll have some downtime to review a lot of the Cree materials and try to apply it to, my day. Talk about, the night, the Pascal, and Ashahagan, the blind, and Basisagan, the gun, and Niskak, and Utjajach, which is the sandhill cranes, and hopefully we'll see some shishipuk ducks. And anyway, and I'll try to review the conjugation tables while I'm there. But that's it for this episode. What did you think about our conversation with Kevin Brousseau? What is your main takeaway? Has this sparked an interest in linguistics? Will you be getting his dictionary or the Moose Cree dictionary? Send us a message on our website, apashish.ca, or email us at apashish.com, or comment on our socials. Sign up for our Substack. Leave a review on our platforms and website. That's it. Jimmy for listening. That's enough for now. Apashish, a Cree learning podcast, is produced and hosted by Lenny Carpenter. Additional editing by Tyler Anjikaneb. Logo design by Robin Kioki. Goose call provided by my niece, Harlow Carpenter. Music by Lenny Carpenter. Have any questions, feedback, or resources to share? Submit a message on our website, apashishpodcast.ca, or email us at apashish@gmail.com. Visit our website to listen to past episodes, view guest bios, and access Cree learning resources. Apashish is supported by the Indigenous Screen Office. Greater Yellow Lake recording by Thomas McGarrian. Sharp-tailed grouse recording by Andrew Spencer. These and other wildlife recordings are accessible at www.zeno-canto.org. Miigwech for listening.